She had always been the kind of girl people couldn't ignore. A face so delicate, a body so perfectly shaped that heads turned wherever she went. But it was never admiration in their eyes, only hunger. Her name was Lena, an orphan who had grown up in a shelter where she was never truly safe. Men looked at her like a prize even when she was too young to understand what they wanted. By the time she turned 18, she had learned the hard way how to avoid their hands, how to dodge the lingering stares. But no matter how much she tried, she could never escape them. One night, as she walked back to the small room she rented, in the city she felt it again, those eyes. The street was nearly empty, only the faint glow of streetlights flickering above. Footsteps echoed behind her, slow, calculated. She turned slightly, her heart pounding, and her eyes met his. He was different, not like the desperate old men who used to whisper dirty things to her in the market, not like the boys who stared at her body like she was something to conquer. No, this man was beautiful, tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. He didn't look at her like the others did. His gaze was unreadable, dark, and full of something she couldn't name. For a second, she forgot to move. Then he smirked. "You're not afraid." His voice was deep, smooth, laced with amusement. Lena took a shaky breath. "Should I be?" The man stepped closer, too close. She could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of something expensive on him. "Maybe," he murmured. "Pretty little things like you. They get eaten alive. In a city like this." Something about his words sent a shiver down her spine, but she refused to show it. She had spent her whole life pretending to be strong. This was no different. She forced a smirk of her own. "Maybe I'm the one who does. The eating." He chuckled, his eyes glinting with something she didn't understand. "We'll see about that." Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. But Lena knew. This wouldn't be the last time she saw him. And she was right. Lena couldn't shake the encounter from her mind. The way he looked at her, the way his voice curled around his words, it was dangerous. She had grown up watching men try to get their way with her, but he was something else, not desperate, not begging, just watching, as if he already knew what was going to happen between them. Days passed, and yet his face lingered in her thoughts like a whisper in the dark. She didn't even know his name. But fate wasn't done with her. One evening she was working at the small diner near her apartment, taking orders, balancing trays, dodging wandering hands like she always did. The city was full of men who thought a waitress in a cheap uniform was free to touch. But she had learned to smile, to twist away, to survive. Then the air shifted. She felt it before she saw him, a familiar presence, him. Her heart jumped as she turned. He was sitting in the farthest booth, one arm stretched along the backrest, his long fingers lazily tapping against the seat. He wasn't looking at the menu. He was looking at her. Lena swallowed hard and forced herself to walk toward him, gripping her notepad tighter than necessary. "You again," she said, keeping her voice even. He smirked. "Me again. What do you want?" He tilted his head slightly, pretending to think. "Coffee. Black." Lena scribbled it down, even though she knew she didn't have to. "That all?" "For now." She turned quickly, heading toward the counter. Her hands trembled as she poured the coffee, her mind racing. She didn't even know him, yet something about him made her pulse quicken in a way she didn't like. When she returned, he was still watching her, his smirk unchanged. "You always this nervous?" he asked as she set the cup down. "I'm not nervous," she shot back. "Liar!" Lena felt heat rise to her cheeks. Damn him. She was about to walk away when his voice stopped her. "Sit with me." She froze. "I'm working." His eyes flicked to the manager, then back to her. "Now, you're not." And just like that, as if on cue, her manager called out, "Lena, take your break." Her stomach twisted. What the hell? Slowly, she slid into the seat across from him, her body tense. "You think you can just snap your fingers and get what you want?" His smirk deepened. "I usually do." Lena clenched her jaw. Well, I'm not like other girls. For the first time his smirk faded. His eyes darkened, studying her, peeling away her defenses layer by layer. Good, he murmured. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down her spine. This man wasn't just dangerous. He was going to change her life, and not in the way she hoped. Lena didn't know why she stayed. She could have walked away, made up an excuse, anything to put distance between herself and this man. But something about him kept her glued to the seat, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "What's your name?" she finally asked, surprising herself. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Now you're curious?" She rolled her eyes. "You show up out of nowhere, act like you own the place, and expect me not to ask." He chuckled, taking a slow sip of his coffee before answering. Zane. The name suited him. Sharp, unreadable, dangerous. Lena nodded, filing it away. "Well, Zane, why are you here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes locking onto hers like he was trying to read her. "Because you interest me," he said finally. Lena's stomach twisted. She had heard those words before, from men who thought they could buy her, own her. But with him it didn't feel like a line. It felt like a warning. "Yeah?" she said, forcing herself to sound unimpressed. "And what happens when I stop interesting you?" Something flickered in his gaze. Something unreadable. "Then, you won't exist to me anymore." Her throat went dry. What the hell does that mean? Before she could press him further, the diner door swung open, and a group of rowdy men walked in. Lena recognized them immediately, regulars who never left without trying to grope her or slip their numbers onto her tray. One of them, a greasy-haired man named Kian, spotted her and grinned. "Lena, baby, come take our order, huh?" Lena clenched her jaw, already dreading the interaction. Zane, however, didn't even turn his head, but she saw his fingers still, his entire posture shifting, like a predator sensing a challenge. Lena quickly stood. "I should—" Before she could finish, Zane grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. Her breath hitched as he pulled her back down into the seat beside him. "What are you doing?" she whispered. His eyes never left hers as he murmured, "Sit still." It wasn't a request. Her heart pounded, torn between fear and something more dangerous, curiosity. Kian, clearly annoyed at being ignored, stalked over to the table, his grin stretching wider. "You deaf, sweetheart?" I said. He barely got the words out before Zane moved. It was fast. A blur of motion as Zane's hand shot out, grabbing Kian's wrist with precision and control. The entire diner went silent. Kian's grin twisted into a grimace. "What the f—" Zane tightened his grip, just enough. "How you don't speak to her like that," he said, voice calm, almost bored. Kian's face reddened as he struggled, but Zane didn't budge. Lena held her breath. She had seen fights before, but this was different. Zane wasn't threatening. Violence. He was violence, controlled, patient, waiting. And Kian. He felt it too. All right, Kian gritted out, trying to yank his hand back. "Let go, man." Zane held on for just a second longer, a second that felt like an eternity. Then, without a word, he let go. Kian stumbled back, cursing under his breath, but he didn't push his luck. He turned, muttering to his friends, and stormed out of the diner. The tension in the room faded, conversations picking up again, but Lena felt frozen. Zane finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't like people touching what's mine." Her breath caught in her throat. "I'm not yours," he smirked. "Not yet." And just like that, she knew. Her life would never be the same. Lena should have left that night. She should have walked away, blocked him out of her mind, and gone back to her life. But deep down, she knew. Her life had already changed the moment she met Zane. He didn't just look at her like other men did. He claimed her not with force, but with something worse. Control. For the next few days, he was everywhere. She would walk home and feel his presence in the shadows, not close enough to scare her, but near enough to remind her that he was watching. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, feeling the ghost of his touch even when he wasn't there. And then one evening he finally made his move. Lena had just finished her shift, exhausted, her legs aching as she locked up the diner. The streets were quiet, the air thick with the scent of city smoke and distant rain. She started walking, her arms wrapped around herself. Then she heard the footsteps, slow, steady, familiar. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't turn around. "Are you following me, Zane?" A chuckle. "I don't follow, I watch." She stopped, finally turning. He was standing under the dim glow of a street lamp, hands in his pockets, that infuriating smirk on his lips. "You should go home," he murmured. "You look tired." Lena's fingers clenched into fists. "You don't get to tell me what to do." Zane took a step forward, then another. Every inch he closed between them made her breath hitch. "I don't?" he asked, tilting his head. "Then why haven't you walked away yet?" Her body betrayed her. She should have run, should have cursed at him, screamed for help. But she didn't. She stood still, waiting. Zane reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather-light yet possessive. "I told you," he murmured. "You interest me." Lena swallowed hard. "And what happens when you get bored?" His smirk faded. For the first time, his expression darkened, something flickering in his gaze. "I don't get bored," he said. Before she could react, before she could even process his words, his lips crashed against hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was claiming. Lena gasped against his mouth, her body tensing. But he was relentless. His fingers tangled in her hair, his body pressing against hers, heat radiating from him like a wildfire she couldn't escape. She should have pushed him away, but she didn't, because deep down she had been waiting for this. And Zane, he knew. Because when he finally pulled away, his lips hovering just above hers, his breath warm against her skin, he smirked. "I told you," he whispered. "You're already mine." And for the first time in her life, Lena realized she had finally met her match. Lena didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her lips still tingling from Zane's kiss. Her body was betraying her, craving something it shouldn't, craving him. She hated it. She hated how easily he got under her skin, how his touch lingered long after he was gone. She had spent years avoiding men like him, the ones who took what they wanted, who saw women as nothing more than temporary. But Zane was different. He didn't beg, he didn't chase, he just took, and the worst part? She let him. By morning, she convinced herself that it was a mistake, a moment of weakness she wouldn't repeat. But deep down, she knew better, because when she stepped out of her apartment that evening, he was already there. Leaning against a sleek black car, cigarette in hand, watching her like he had been waiting all night. Lena's breath caught. He looked dangerous in the golden glow of the streetlights, his shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the sharp cut of his collarbones, his sleeves rolled up, exposing strong forearms. He took a slow drag of his cigarette before exhaling, his eyes locked onto hers. "Morning, beautiful." Her pulse quickened. "What are you doing here?" His lips curled at the edges. "Waiting for you." Lena crossed her arms. "I'm not yours, Zane." He pushed off the car, stepping closer. "You keep saying that, but you never walk away." She held her ground even as he stopped inches from her. His scent wrapped around her, smoky, expensive, intoxicating. "You think you can control me," she challenged. Zane chuckled, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't need to. You want this as much as I do." Lena's stomach twisted. He was right, and he knew it. She hated him for it. "I have work," she said, stepping back. "I don't have time for games." Zane tilted his head. Who said this was a game? Before she could respond, he opened the passenger door of his car. "Get in." Lena narrowed her eyes. "Why would I?" Zane smirked. "Because if you don't, you'll spend the whole night thinking about me, wondering what would have happened if you did." Her heart pounded. He was right again. With a frustrated sigh, she slid into the seat. Zane smirked, shutting the door behind her before walking around to the driver's side. As the engine roared to life, she turned to him. "This doesn't mean anything," she muttered. Zane glanced at her, his smirk widening. "Keep telling yourself that, princess." And as they drove off into the night, Lena knew she was already in too deep. Lena told herself she wouldn't let it happen again. She wasn't like other girls. She didn't fall for smooth words, expensive cars, or dangerous men who looked at her like she was something to own. She had spent her whole life avoiding men like Zane. But that night, she let him drive her through the city. The streets blurred past, the glow of streetlights flickering against the car windows. Lena kept her arms crossed, her body tense, her mind screaming at her to get out while she still could. But Zane was too calm. One hand on the wheel, the other resting against his thigh, eyes focused on the road as if this was just another normal night for him. "You're quiet," he murmured, barely glancing at her. Lena scoffed. "What do you expect me to say? Thanks for kidnapping me." Zane chuckled. "If I kidnapped you, you wouldn't be sitting here by choice." She hated that he was right. Again. She exhaled sharply. "Where are we going?" "You'll see." Lena clenched her jaw. "You're really bad at answering questions." Zane smirked. "And you're really bad at staying away from me." Her stomach twisted. She turned toward the window, refusing to let him see the heat rising to her cheeks. Minutes passed in silence until the car finally pulled into a dimly lit parking lot. Lena frowned. They were in front of a luxury high-rise, the kind of place she had only seen in magazines. She turned to him. "Seriously?" Zane cut the engine, turning to face her. "Get out." Lena hesitated. "I told you, this doesn't mean anything." Zane's smirk faded. For the first time, his expression was serious. "I don't do things that mean nothing, Lena." Something about the way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. She should have left. She should have walked away, told him she wasn't interested, ended whatever this was before it could start. But she didn't. Instead, she stepped out of the car. Zane led her inside, past the concierge who barely glanced at them, into a private elevator that required a key card. Of course, the doors closed. Lena felt the tension in the small space, thick enough to suffocate her. She could feel Zane beside her, his body heat, the faint scent of cologne and cigarette smoke. The numbers on the elevator climbed. 10, 15, Tamusus, then ding. The doors slid open. Lena stepped into a sleek modern penthouse, floor-to-ceiling windows, black leather furniture, a view of the entire city. She turned to Zane, arms crossed. "What now? You expect me to be impressed?" Zane stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "No." He reached out, tilting her chin up with 2 fingers. "I expect you to stop pretending you don't want this." Her breath hitched. She should have slapped him, should have walked away, but instead, she let him kiss her. And this time she didn't hold back. She let herself get lost in him, and she didn't realize her mistake until it was already too late. Lena didn't stop him. She should have, but the moment his lips crashed into hers, she lost all sense of reason. Zane kissed like he owned her, like he had already decided she belonged to him. His hands slid around her waist, pulling her flush against him, and she let him take control, let him deepen the kiss until her knees felt weak. She hated herself for how much she wanted it. When he lifted her effortlessly, carrying her toward the sleek black couch, she didn't resist. She didn't say no when he laid her down beneath him, when his lips traveled down her neck, when his hands roamed places no man had touched before. She let him have her, and she had never felt so alive. Lena woke up tangled in silk sheets, the morning sunlight creeping through the floor-to-ceiling windows. For a moment, she didn't move. She didn't want to move. Her body ached in ways she had never experienced before, a reminder of everything that had happened last night. Then reality crashed down. She turned her head and found the bed empty. Zane was gone. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. She pushed herself up, pulling the sheet around her, scanning the penthouse. No note, no message, nothing. She clenched, her jaw. Of course, this was what she had been afraid of. This was what men like him did. They took, they consumed, and when they were done, they left. Lena forced herself out of bed, her body still sore. She found her clothes on the floor, hastily put them back on, and grabbed her phone from the table. No messages, no missed calls. She should have known better. Biting down her disappointment, she grabbed her things and walked out of the penthouse. She told herself she didn't care, but deep down, she knew. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. And soon, she would realize just how much that night had changed everything. Weeks passed. Lena forced herself to forget about Zane. She went to work, ignored the lingering memories of his touch, and convinced herself it had been nothing more than a one-time mistake. Then, one morning, as she stood in front of the mirror, brushing her teeth, she felt it, a wave of nausea. It came out of nowhere, violent and sudden. She barely made it to the sink before she threw up. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, her breathing ragged. No, this couldn't be happening. Her mind raced, panic tightening around her chest. She grabbed her phone, checked the calendar, counted the days. Her stomach dropped. She was late. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." This wasn't possible, it couldn't be. But the dread in her chest told her the truth. She needed to take a test, and when she did, her entire world collapsed. Pregnant. The word stared back at her, bold and undeniable. Lena's legs gave out and she sank to the floor, her breath coming in short gasps. She was pregnant. With his child. And Zane? He didn't even care enough to stay. Lena sat on the bathroom floor, staring at the test in her shaking hands. Pregnant. The word felt unreal, like some cruel joke. Her mind refused to accept it, yet there it was. Clear as day. Her stomach twisted. This couldn't be happening. Zane had disappeared after that night. No calls, no texts, no sign that he even remembered her. And now she was carrying his child. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent her whole life alone, fighting to survive in a world that never gave her anything. She wasn't going to break now. Lena sucked in a shaky breath and forced herself to stand. She needed to think. Keeping the baby? Impossible. She could barely afford rent, let alone raise a child. And Zane? He wasn't the kind of man who stuck around. He had taken what he wanted and vanished, just like she had feared. Her throat tightened. Would he even care if he knew? Probably not. But something inside her whispered, you have to tell him. She didn't want to. She didn't owe him anything. But deep down she knew. Zane wasn't just any man. And if he found out on his own? Lena shuddered. She had seen what he was capable of, the way he handled men who disrespected her. If he discovered she had kept this from him? No. She had to be the one to tell him. But how? He had disappeared, left no trace behind. She had no way of finding him, until her phone buzzed. Her breath hitched. She grabbed it off the counter, heart racing as she read the name flashing across the screen. Zane. Her fingers trembled as she hesitated, staring at the screen. After weeks of silence, after everything, why was he calling now? Her pulse thundered in her ears as she finally answered. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello?" A pause. Then, "Did you miss me, Princess?" Lena's stomach flipped. That voice. Smooth, deep, arrogant as ever, like nothing had happened. Rage bubbled inside her. "You—" "Careful," Zane murmured, amusement dripping from his tone. "You sound angry. And here I thought you'd be happy to hear from me." Lena's hands clenched into fists. "Where the hell have you been?" Another pause, then busy. Her breath caught. That was it? That was all he had to say? Weeks of silence, of pretending she didn't exist, and he just expected her to accept that? Something inside her snapped. "Well, guess what, Zane?" she hissed. "I've been busy. Too." A beat of silence. Then his voice dropped. "Careful, Lena." She could almost see the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes darkened. But she didn't care, because now she had nothing to lose. "You disappeared," she said, voice shaking with anger. "You left like it was nothing. But guess what?" She took a deep breath. And then she said it. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then finally, "Where are you?" Lena froze. His voice was different now, low, deadly. "Zane, where are you?" Her breath hitched. This wasn't the reaction she expected. She thought he would laugh, tell her it wasn't his problem, hang up. But instead, his voice had turned cold, sharp, dangerous. Like he wasn't asking. Like he was coming for her. Lena swallowed hard, her heart slamming against her ribs. She had made a mistake. Zane wasn't just any man. And now? She was about to find out what happened when you kept a secret from him. Lena's grip tightened around her phone. Zane's voice still echoed in her ears, sharp and commanding, sending a chill down her spine. "Where are you?" She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her not to tell him. But what choice did she have? If she lied, he would find her anyway. So she took a shaky breath and whispered, "My apartment." The line went dead. Her stomach twisted. She stared at her phone, half expecting him to call back, to say something, anything. But the silence only grew heavier. Lena barely had time to process what she had done before she heard it. The roar of an engine. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she rushed to her window. Down on the street, a sleek black car came to a stop. Zane. A lump formed in her throat. She barely had time to back away before a knock sounded at her door. Not loud. Not impatient, just certain. Lena's fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. She knew she shouldn't open it. She knew once she did, there would be no turning back. But she did it anyway. And there he was. Zane stood in the doorway, tall and dangerous, his expression unreadable. His jaw was tight, his dark eyes scanning her face like he was trying to decipher her thoughts. She swallowed. "You got here fast. I don't like to waste time." His voice was calm, but there was something simmering beneath the surface, something that made her shiver. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, locking them in. Lena took a step back. "You don't get to just show up like this." Zane's gaze dropped to her stomach for a brief second before snapping back to her eyes. "How long?" She crossed her arms. "Why do you care?" His jaw tightened. "Lena." "Don't say my name like that," she snapped. "Like, you have a right to be angry." His eyes darkened. "I have every right." She laughed bitterly. "Oh? Because you had one night with me and then disappeared? You don't get to act like you—" Before she could finish, he closed the space between them in one step. Lena gasped as her back hit the wall. Zane's hands slammed on either side of her, caging her in. His scent, cologne, smoke, something, undeniably him, wrapped around her, making her dizzy. His voice was low, dangerous. "You should have told me the second you found out." Lena's breath hitched. "Why? So you could tell me to get rid of it?" Zane's eyes flashed. "Do? I look like the kind of man who would do that." She hesitated. No, he didn't, but she didn't understand him. He had left without a word, and now he was here, standing in front of her like he had some kind of claim over her life. Lena squared her shoulders. "I don't need anything from you, Zane." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "You think this is just about you?" Her stomach twisted. What else would it be about? His fingers brushed against her stomach. So light, so fleeting, she almost thought she imagined it. Then his voice dropped to a whisper. "That's my child." Lena froze. The way he said it. Possessive. Unyielding. Final. She had expected anger, rejection, indifference. But she hadn't expected this. "Zane," she started, but he cut her off. "You don't have to want me," he murmured, his lips inches from hers. "But you don't get to keep my child from me." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to push him away, wanted to tell him she didn't need him, but the truth was, she wasn't sure if she believed it anymore. And Zane, he had already decided. Lena wasn't going anywhere, and neither was his child. Lena could barely breathe. Zane's words hung in the air like a warning, like a promise she couldn't escape. "You don't have to want me, but you don't get to keep my child from me." She swallowed hard, her back pressed against the wall, his body so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. Lena wasn't naive. She had seen men walk away too many times. She had been abandoned before she could even remember. She knew what it meant to be unwanted. But this? Zane wasn't walking away. And somehow that terrified her more. She took a shaky breath. You don't get to control this. Zane's jaw clenched. I don't need to. Lena glared at him. What the hell does that mean? He leaned in, his lips brushing just beside her ear. It means, I always get what I want, princess. A shiver ran down her spine, but she forced herself to push him away. Distance. She needed distance. Zane let her go, but his gaze never wavered. Lena ran a hand through her hair, trying to steady her voice. What do you want, Zane? His expression didn't change. I want what's mine. Her stomach twisted. You think you own me now? A slow smirk tugged at his lips. Not yet. Her breath hitched. Damn him. I don't need your money, she said quickly, trying to shift the conversation. I don't need anything from you. Zane didn't react. He just slipped, his hands into his pockets, and tilted his head, watching her, studying her. Then he said, Who said anything about money? Lena froze. Her heart pounded as she stared at him, trying to understand what game he was playing. Zane took a slow step forward, closing the distance once again. You think I'm here to throw cash at you and walk away? His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, a warning. Lena swallowed. Isn't that what men like you do? Zane's smirk disappeared. Not when it's my child. She didn't know why his words made her stomach tighten. Maybe because she had never been fought for before, never had someone stay. Zane took another step forward, forcing her to look up at him. You're carrying my child, he murmured, voice lower now, softer. That means you're not alone anymore, Lena. She hated how her chest tightened at his words. She had always been alone, always. And now? Now this dangerous, unreadable man was standing in front of her, acting like this was his responsibility. Like he wasn't going to disappear. Lena shook her head. I don't need you to... Zane cupped her jaw, his fingers pressing just enough to make her stop. I don't care what you need. Her breath hitched. He leaned in, lips brushing against hers, but he didn't kiss her. He just whispered, You're mine now, princess. And the worst part? Lena didn't know if she wanted to run or if she wanted to stay. Need 2,000 likes on video and 500 shares for part 2 of this story.